What's up guys, welcome back. In today's video we're going to look at how you can achieve this awesome ginger hair effect. I first mixed up a dark reddy brown by adding some Chimera Magenta into some Chimera Red Oxide. Adding the magenta just gives it a bit more of a lively appearance. Then in order to make sure that we're able to build up enough contrast, I darkened it down slightly by adding some black. This was painted onto the hair over a couple of thin coats. Chimera paints cover quite well, so I was able to get a solid, even coverage fairly quickly. Slow down when you get near the face and really make sure you get a clean outline without damaging any of the work you've already done. To create the initial highlights, I mixed some Chimera Orange and a small amount of warm yellow into the base colour to lighten it and make it more saturated. The clothing on this model is going to have quite a complex, busy look, so I'm adding the yellow here to help boost the vibrancy of the hair, and that should help to overpower the clothes, drawing the viewer's gaze upwards. To continue, you're going to roughly paint this onto the areas where you want the highlights, so onto the peaks of the rounded parts of the hair at the top of the head. And then here on the back, around the middle part of this fairly flat area. Rather than painting towards the end of the hair, it's better to think about the light hitting across the flat area, much like the highlights on a long flat piece of metal. So running horizontally across the width. The more straight the hair, the more intense and straight your highlight would be. Ours isn't perfectly straight, so there will be a fair bit of variation across the highlight, so I'm just trying to give a general sense of where that would be at this early stage. I find painting here becomes more awkward the more straight it is. It's way more fun when there's a lot of flow and curls, but it's good to paint things that you're not that comfortable with. That's one way that you can get better. Notice that I'm not worried about the sculpted details. Instead, I'm focusing on giving a general impression of where the light would be, ignoring the details altogether. You can add them later as your paint gets brighter. It's a good idea to apply a second layer of paint to ensure that you get a nice coverage with your highlight layer. With those placed in, I'll begin to soften out the edges of the highlight by placing small lines along the boundary between the highlight and the base tone. And when I'm doing this, I'm trying to hit the raised hair details, leaving the recesses in shadow. Adding some texture around the edge of the highlight is another way you can create a blended effect. And you can do this whether the texture is sculpted or not. If it's totally smooth, you can still add in textures to help fade the colour out. We'll continue by adding a little more orange and warm yellow to our highlight. Now we're going to paint that onto the hair in much the same way as before, but this time we're going to aim to cover a smaller surface area. Like the last layer, we'll largely ignore the sculpted details, focusing instead on boosting the shapes within the hair as a whole. When you're painting this, it's good to understand what you're aiming for. The more intense we make the orange, the more impact the hair will have. But what we gain in impact, we're going to lose in realism. So you have to ask yourself whether you want something that's intense or something realistic. Personally, I'm going to try and bridge the gap between the two, stopping just short of full saturation, but still orange enough that it draws the eye upwards. We'll also try and pick out the top side of any of these little straggly bits near the tips of the hairs, but only where the hair is facing the light. Once you're happy with the coverage, we'll again place some texture around the edges of the highlights, picking out some of the sculpted hair detail in order to help blend out that layer. When you're doing this, try not to make your lines too even. Vary the length so that you have a random mix of short, medium and long lines. That's going to give you a more natural and interesting effect than if you were to strive for uniformity. Also, it's a good idea to move the brush towards your highlight as you do this. Your brush strokes are generally going to start off somewhat transparent, with more paint coming off the brush at the end of your stroke. Thus, by ending your stroke as it travels into the main highlight, you're able to create a more natural fade from one colour to the next. It's good to realise that it's very probable that it's not going to look great at this early stage, but don't panic about that. There's always a period when you're painting anything where things are going to look a bit crap. It's just the nature of the beast. With a bit of patience and perseverance, you're going to be able to power through that and get to a more pleasing result. Add a little more orange and warm yellow to your highlight, boosting the vibrancy and making it a bit more orange. We'll start to apply this in the same areas as before, but this time we're going to work on picking out the strands of hair by putting more focus into hitting the raised sculpted details. Notice I'm trying to paint around the peak of the roundy part of the head. I'm not pulling the highlight up to the top part of the head, as that would look rather odd. Instead, imagine the light coming down at a bit of an angle and hitting the hair around the side, forming almost a halo-like effect. On this section, the hair is flatter, but not perfectly so. There's still some movement within it. So what I'm going to do is find where the light will be strongest on each strand around this general area. Try to follow the flow of the hair and pick out the high points. Imagine a line running along here and make your highlights more intense closer to that line. You don't have to follow that line exactly, just use it as a general guide, but don't be afraid to deviate outside it. Remember, we're not going for realism here, but even so, we still want it to make sense to the viewer. If you like a detail, or if you think it might look cool, then just add a highlight that falls outside the line. Remember, you're painting a 3D figure, which people are going to be looking at from different angles as they turn it around, so a very strict fixed lighting can look really cool in pictures, but you'll usually end up with certain angles that look a bit silly. So I try and take the middle road and get something that'll look decent in a picture or in the hand. So I'm trying to be cognizant of the light situation, but I'm not a slave to it. Apply this over a few layers until you're happy with the intensity of your highlights. In order to push the highlights further, I first create a very light yellow colour by mixing some Chimera Cold Yellow into some white. This is then mixed into the orange highlight from the previous step in order to make it brighter. If we just add white straight into the orange, you end up with quite a flat, pale orange highlight, but we want to give the hair some life and a bit of a shine, so adding the yellow helps to achieve that as it makes the colour more vibrant, thus drawing the viewer's attention and making the highlights more eye-catching. We'll paint this on at the brightest point of each individual hair, making sure to cover a significantly smaller area than the previous layers, and we work out where to place these on a case-by-case basis. Look at the hair and try and visualise where the light would be hitting it. Place your highlights in those spots. The shape of each strand will be a little different, so where you add your highlight will vary slightly across the surface. This is going to result in a much more natural highlighting pattern. If you look at real hair, you'll see the light often dances around in an almost zigzag pattern around the head. Unless the hair has been iron flat, the highlight won't follow a straight line across it. You already have a guide for where to place your highlights from the previous layers, but you should strive to make the difference in placement more distinct with this brighter colour, so that they don't go on totally uniform. So we're still painting onto the highest point of each strand, but we're being more picky about accentuating the individual high points. Again, still using fairly thin consistency so that we can pull the paint into position. This allows us to form a natural blend by building up the highlights over a number of layers. On the flatter area, we'll again try and imagine that line running along here and just pick out the hairs that cross over that general area. Again, painting the strands individually and trying to vary the highlight placement based on the shape of the hairs. So if they are curled, we'll try and hit the peak of the raised part, but if they're more straight, you can highlight them towards the middle or towards the tip, depending on which you think might look better. Apply this over a couple of layers until you get your highlights nice and bright and you're happy with the blending. Don't do this blindly though. If you apply 2 layers and the colour still looks a bit dull, just whack another one on there. Try not to paint by the numbers, instead let your eyes tell you when you've done enough. Once you're happy with the coverage, add a bit more of the bright yellow into your mix to lighten it, pushing it more towards the yellow this time, and we'll use that to boost the highlights from our previous layer. Again, targeting the individual hairs, doing your best to avoid hitting any recesses. This time, make your highlights a lot smaller than you did before. And don't forget to further emphasize that feeling of the highlights being a little variable, so that they don't all line up with each other. Target the high points on the hair. If you imagine the hair is on a curve, you don't want to hit the top of the hair, you're looking for the highest point on the curve. Even though your highlights are quite small at this stage, this layer is going to change the overall appearance of the hair quite dramatically. I'd say this is the moment where the hair starts to come alive. These highlights give a real boost to the colour and help to bring out the details within the hair. It's quite fun to see the change happening. I think this part here feels a little bare, so what I'll do is add a couple small highlights towards the tip of these smaller hairs, just to pick out the detail. Yep, that looks a bit better now. Don't be scared to add in some extra highlights that fall outside your main ones. If you feel like it's going to improve the overall look, then just put them in. But don't overdo it or it'll end up looking too chaotic. Alright, so you're just going to keep working your way around the hair, placing these small highlights in the brightest spots of each hair. We're going to be adding another highlight on top of these, so make them small but not so small that you won't be able to add another highlight on top. When you're happy with those, add some more of the yellow into the mix, making it significantly brighter, and we'll go back and add some final highlights. So for these, we're going to target the very center of your previous layer and try to place a small dot right in the brightest spot, trying your best not to cover up the whole of your previous highlight layer. Use a brush with a sharp point and very gingerly touch the tip of the center of your highlight, just enough to glance the surface so that you leave a tiny dot of paint behind. If you mess up and it goes on too big, you can quickly wipe it off the surface with a second brush. Keep working your way around the model, placing those small dots into the brightest part of your highlights. Notice the way the highlights don't line up perfectly. This is the key to getting a more interesting and natural effect. It gives your figure a dynamic, lively appearance. If they're all uniform in a straight line, it'll look okay, but it won't be as compelling. If you like, you can also add a few random tiny dots into the darker areas. This will give you a bit of a sparkly effect. Now, this is just something I quite like doing, but it's not to everyone's taste, so you can leave this out if it's not your thing. I just think it gives the viewer a bit more to look at, plus it's fun to do. It's the same sort of idea as when you're painting non-metallic metals. These dots need to go in as small as possible. I find very lightly tapping the surface with the tip of the brush gives the best effect. Just make sure you don't create a pattern when you're doing this, they should go on randomly. Thanks for watching, let me know your thoughts in the comments, be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and as always, don't forget to choose life, paint minis.